I never used to wake up in the middle of the night. Sleep came easily to me, a blessing I took for granted until that first night when everything changed. It started with a gentle vibration, so subtle I thought I was imagining it. My phone, face down on the nightstand, was trembling against the wood surface. The display showed 3:33 a.m. when I picked it up, though I hadn't set any alarms. The screen was blank, no notifications, no missed calls, yet it continued to vibrate in my hand with an intensity that made my fingers tingle. I tried to turn it off, but the power button didn't respond. The vibration grew stronger, and a faint hum began emanating from the speaker, not the usual electronic tones, but something deeper, almost organic. That's when I noticed the shadows in my bedroom weren't behaving normally. They seemed to pulse in rhythm with my phone's vibrations, as if the darkness itself was breathing. The familiar shapes of my furniture had taken on strange, elongated forms that didn't match their usual silhouettes. My closet door, which I always left slightly ajar, was now firmly closed. I sat perfectly still, trying to convince myself this was just a peculiar dream. But the cool air against my skin felt too real, and the faint scent of ozone that filled the room was too specific to be a product of my sleeping mind. The humming from my phone grew louder, transforming into something that almost resembled words spoken in reverse. My bedside lamp wouldn't turn on when I tried to dispel the darkness. The switch clicked uselessly, and I could have sworn I heard something like a soft laugh coming from the corner of my room. Not the kind of laugh that brings warmth or joy, this was the sound of something amused by my futile attempts to assert control over my environment. The digital clock on my nightstand flickered for a moment, its red numbers distorting before settling back to 3:33. I watched in growing horror as the minutes ticked by on my phone, 3:34, 3:35, 3:36. But the clock remained frozen at 3:33, as if time had snagged on that particular moment and refused to move forward. A soft scratching sound drew my attention to the ceiling. At first, it seemed to be coming from above my bed, but as I listened, I realized it was moving, dragging itself slowly across the ceiling toward the center of the room. The sound was deliberate, like fingernails being drawn across plaster with careful precision. I wanted to look up, but something deep inside warned me that seeing the source of that sound would be dangerous. The temperature in the room dropped suddenly, and my breath began forming visible clouds in the air. The vibrating phone in my hand grew ice-cold, yet I couldn't bring myself to let go of it. It felt like my only connection to the normal world, even as it continued to hum with that almost language I couldn't quite understand. The scratching sound stopped directly above me. In the silence that followed, I could hear my own heartbeat, too loud and too fast. The shadows in the corners of my room seemed to deepen, growing denser until they looked like pools of liquid darkness. And then, ever so slowly, something began to drip from the ceiling, not water, but something darker and more viscous that disappeared before it reached my bed. I wanted to scream, to run, to do anything except sit there frozen in terror. But my body wouldn't respond. It was as if the same force that held time at 3:33 had also taken control of my muscles. The only movement I could manage was the trembling of my hands, which matched the rhythm of my still vibrating phone. That's when I heard it, a voice, clear as day, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. It spoke only 3 words, but they changed everything I thought I knew about reality: "You're finding us." The phone in my hand suddenly grew blazing hot, and I finally dropped it onto the bed. The screen cracked in a pattern that looked unsettlingly like a face, and for just a moment, I could have sworn I saw something moving behind the glass, peering out at me through the fractured display. The next morning, I convinced myself it had been a nightmare. The cracked phone screen was real enough, but I attributed it to dropping the device in my sleep-addled state. I went about my day as usual, but something had shifted in my perception of reality. Like a painting hung slightly crooked, just enough to create a sense of unease. That night, I took precautions. I removed the batteries from my clock, turned off my phone, and even unplugged every electronic device in my bedroom. Sleep came reluctantly, my mind replaying the events of the previous night in an endless loop. When consciousness crept back, I knew before opening my eyes that something was wrong. The air felt charged, like the moment before a lightning strike. My phone, which should have been powered down, was softly vibrating against the wooden nightstand. Without looking, I knew exactly what time it would show. The numbers 3 verse 33 cast a sickly red glow across my trembling hands, but something was different this time. The shadows weren't just moving, they were forming patterns on my walls, intricate spirals and curves that reminded me of ancient Celtic knots. As I watched, they began to resolve into what looked like writing in a script I'd never seen before, yet somehow felt I should be able to read. The scratching sound returned, but it wasn't coming from the ceiling anymore. It was emanating from inside my walls, as if something was tracing those shadowy patterns from the other side. The sound followed the movement of the dark symbols, creating them in real time like some unseen hand writing a message. I was afraid to understand them. My phone screen flickered, and in the momentary darkness, I caught a glimpse of movement in my mirror. Something was standing behind me, a figure composed of deeper shadows than should have been possible. I couldn't turn around. I didn't dare. But in the mirror's reflection, I watched as it slowly raised what might have been an arm, pointing at the wall of shifting symbols. A voice whispered from the phone speaker, different from the previous night but carrying the same otherworldly quality: "The patterns are doors." The words seemed to hover in the air, visible for a fraction of a second as faintly glowing script before dissolving into the darkness. The temperature plummeted again, but this time, frost began forming on my windows in the same intricate patterns that covered my walls. The ice spread rapidly, creating layer upon layer of symbols that caught the dim light and reflected it in impossible ways. Within these frozen fractals, I could see brief glimpses of somewhere else. A place where geometry obeyed different laws, where colors existed that had no names in any human language. My phone began cycling through images at a dizzying speed, photos I had never taken, showing places I had never been. But in each one, if you looked carefully at the background, you could just make out a familiar figure composed of living shadow. And in every image, the time stamp read 3:33. The mirror behind me cracked, not with a sudden sharp sound, but with a slow, deliberate movement that formed yet another pattern. The figure reflected in its surface seemed to smile, not with anything resembling a mouth, but with a subtle shift in the density of its shadows that conveyed a terrible amusement. "The doors go both ways," the voice whispered, now coming from the cracked mirror rather than my phone. "And sometimes, they open on their own." As if in response to these words, one of the shadowy symbols on my wall began to deepen, turning into what appeared to be an actual opening, a void in the fabric of reality itself. And from within that impossible darkness, I heard something taking a deep, shuddering breath. That I spent the following day in a fog of exhaustion and mounting paranoia. Every reflection caught in windows or polished surfaces made my heart skip, expecting to see that shadowy figure standing behind me. The symbols I'd seen on my walls lingered in my mind like afterimages, appearing in the corners of my vision whenever I tried to focus on anything else. My search for answers led me to the university library's rare book collection, where I found myself drawn to texts I wouldn't normally notice. Ancient volumes seemed to call out to me, their spines catching my attention with patterns that reminded me of the ones that had covered my walls. My hands trembled as I opened a leather-bound tome on medieval timekeeping devices, its pages brittle with age and smelling of dust and decay. The librarian found me there at closing time, surrounded by stacks of books on chronology and dimensional theory. She touched my shoulder, and I nearly screamed. For a moment, her shadow on the wall had looked impossibly elongated, its edges writhing like tentacles in dark water. But when I turned to look at her directly, everything appeared normal. Almost too normal, as if reality was trying too hard to convince me of its solidity. That I noticed the time as I left the library, 3:33 p.m. The sun was setting early, though it was barely autumn, and the quality of light seemed wrong somehow, too thick, like honey dripping down the sides of buildings. The shadows cast by trees and lampposts stretched toward me as I walked, not following the natural angle of the sun. Back in my apartment, I spread my research materials across my desk, photographs of ancient astronomical charts and copied passages about time slips and dimensional convergences. The more I read, the more a pattern emerged, one that made my blood run cold. Throughout history, there were accounts of people experiencing similar phenomena, always at 3:33. Some cultures called it the inverted hour, when the barrier between realities grew thin. My notes began to change as I wrote them. The words remained the same, but the shapes of the letters seemed to twist into those same mysterious symbols I'd seen on my walls. I found myself unconsciously drawing spiraling patterns in the margins of my notebook, my hand moving of its own accord. When I finally noticed what I was doing, I realized I'd covered pages with intricate diagrams that made my eyes hurt to look at directly. The sun had set completely now, but I couldn't bring myself to turn on any lights. The darkness felt safer somehow, less revealing. In the dim glow of my laptop screen, I could see my reflection, and something else, a deeper darkness gathering behind me, patient and attentive. It was studying my research as intently as I was, its presence a weight of focused attention I could feel pressing against my skull. A notification popped up on my laptop, battery critical. But when I went to plug it in, the power cord slipped through my fingers, its plastic surface unexpectedly slick with something that felt like cold oil. The socket in the wall seemed to recede as I reached for it, the distance between my hand and the outlet stretching impossibly. The temperature began to drop, and I watched in horrified fascination as my breath formed shapes in the air, not random clouds, but more of those ancient symbols. They hung suspended before me for moments longer than they should have, glowing faintly with a light that seemed to absorb rather than emit illumination. My phone buzzed once, sharp and sudden in the silence. A text message from an unknown number consisted solely of symbols matching the ones I'd been researching. As I stared at them, they began to arrange themselves into words I could almost understand. The meaning hovered just at the edge of comprehension, like a word on the tip of my tongue. The shadow behind me shifted, and I felt rather than heard its whispered revelation, "You're learning our language." My own shadow on the wall began to move independently of my body, its edges blurring and reshaping themselves to match the figure standing behind me. Soon, it continued, "You'll be ready to understand." Understanding, I was beginning to realize, might be the most dangerous part of all. Sleep became impossible. Even during daylight hours, I found myself jolting awake at precisely 3:33, my body somehow attuned to that fractured moment in time. The symbols I'd been studying had begun to appear everywhere, in coffee stains on my desk, in the arrangement of fallen leaves on my walkway, in the condensation patterns on my bathroom mirror. Reality itself seemed to be communicating in this ancient language, and worse still, I was beginning to understand it. My apartment had taken on a different character, as if the walls themselves had developed an awareness. The corners of rooms never quite matched up anymore when I looked at them directly, and I swore the dimensions of spaces changed when I walked through doorways. Sometimes I'd enter my kitchen and find it stretched impossibly long, the far end disappearing into shadows that writhed with barely contained purpose. The figure that had been watching me was growing bolder. I caught glimpses of it in reflective surfaces even during daylight hours now, a darkness deeper than shadow that seemed to fold space around itself. It no longer stayed behind me, but moved freely through my peripheral vision, leaving trails of cold air and whispered symbols in its wake. The most terrifying part was how natural its presence had begun to feel. That afternoon, I found myself drawing again, my hand moving with fevered purpose across pages of my notebook. But this time, I understood what I was writing. The symbols spoke of doorways between moments, of spaces that existed in the pause between seconds. They described beings that had evolved in these impossible intervals, entities that had watched humanity through the cracks in time since we first began measuring its passage. My phone hadn't stopped vibrating since morning, though I'd removed its battery days ago. The screen displayed an endless stream of symbols now, each one burning itself into my retinas until I saw them overlaid on everything I looked at. They told a story of hunger, not for flesh or blood, but for perception itself. These entities fed on the moment of comprehension when a human mind grasped something it was never meant to understand. The sun was setting again, though I couldn't remember if this was the same day or another one entirely. Time had become slippery, moments bleeding into each other like watercolors in rain. I watched as the shadow of my hand on the desk began moving independently, forming shapes that my flesh hadn't made. My skin had become translucent in the fading light, and beneath it, I could see patterns moving, flowing through my veins like dark mercury. A sound drew my attention to the window, a soft tapping, like fingernails on glass. The reflection showed me what I'd become, a being of shifting shadows and written light, my edges blurring into the symbols that now covered every surface of my room. The figure that had been watching me stood close behind, its form merging with mine in the glass. We were becoming the same thing, our shadows intertwining like lovers in the dark. The transition has begun, it whispered, its voice now indistinguishable from my own thoughts. You've learned to read the spaces between moments. Now you must learn to exist within them. My hand passed through the solid surface of my desk as if it were smoke. The symbols had become a pulse, a heartbeat, a new way of understanding reality. Every tick of the clock created ripples in space-time that I could now see and touch. The world had become a text written in a language of quantum possibilities, and I was becoming a living translation. The last rays of sunlight bent around my form like water around a stone, and I realized with mounting horror, or was it ecstasy, that I was no longer casting any shadow at all. I had become something else, something that existed in the spaces that light forgot to illuminate. And somewhere in the distance, a clock was striking 3:33, though I couldn't remember if it was AM or PM anymore. It no longer seemed to matter. Part 5, the other's time had become a tangible thing, something I could reach out and touch like silk sliding between my fingers. In the spaces between seconds, I discovered I wasn't alone. Others dwelled here, beings that had once been human, who had followed the same path of symbols and shadows that had led to my transformation. They flickered at the edges of perception, their forms rippling like heat waves over summer asphalt. My apartment had become a nexus point, a place where reality wore thin enough to see through to what lay beneath. The walls breathed with memories of other times, other possibilities. Photographs on my shelves showed versions of my life that I had never lived, yet somehow remembered. In one, I stood smiling beside a family I'd never met, but whose name sat heavy on my tongue like half-remembered dreams. The first time I saw another like me, I was standing in my kitchen at what my phone insisted was 3:33 p.m., though the quality of light suggested neither day nor night. She emerged from the space between my refrigerator and the wall, unfolding from an impossibly narrow gap like origami in reverse. Her form was composed of overlapping symbols that shifted and flowed, but her eyes, God, her eyes were still human, and they held such knowledge in them. The threshold period is the hardest, she said, her voice resonating in frequencies that made my remaining solid bones ache. When you're caught between states, neither fully here nor there. But it gets easier once you stop fighting the language. The language she spoke of wasn't just symbols anymore, it was a way of existing. Each gesture she made left trails in the air like ripples in a pond, creating meanings that bypassed my eyes and went straight to some deeper understanding. I watched as she demonstrated, her fingers drawing patterns that altered the fabric of space around us. The kitchen ceiling became transparent, revealing not the apartment above, but a vast, geometric void filled with writing in light. We are the archivists, she explained, though her words came to me as patterns of shadow and light rather than sound. We record the moments that slip through the cracks of conventional time. The stories that happen in the pauses between heartbeats. The memories that exist in the spaces where people fear to look. My own form had begun to fluctuate more drastically now. Parts of me would become transparent without warning, revealing the complex patterns that had replaced my internal organs. The symbols that had once covered my walls now flowed through me like blood, each one carrying fragments of knowledge that belonged to other times, other lives. The others taught me how to move through the spaces between spaces. How to fold myself into the angles that reality forgot about, emerging in moments that existed outside of conventional chronology. But with each new skill came a price. Memories of my former life began to fade, replaced by records of events I had witnessed but never experienced. I remembered the fall of Rome as clearly as my own childhood, and could no longer distinguish which memories belonged to my original timeline. My phone had evolved along with me, its screen now a window into the void where we dwelled. Through it, I could see the currents of time flowing like rivers of light, carrying snippets of possibility, lives unlived, choices unmade, paths untaken. The others used these streams to navigate, surfing the waves of probability between moments of decision, but something was wrong. The patterns were changing, showing signs of instability I hadn't seen before. The others became agitated, their forms flickering more rapidly between states. The barriers are thinning, my mentor whispered, her form dissolving and reforming with each word. Too many have crossed over. Too many gaps have been created. I watched in horror as reality began to crack around us, hairline fractures appearing in the air itself. Through these fissures, I could see things moving, ancient things that had been waiting in the spaces we had disturbed. They were vast and geometric, their forms following patterns that hurt to comprehend, and they were hungry for more than just understanding. The others were wrong. We weren't archivists at all, but we were door openers. And now the doors would not close. The cracks in reality spread like frost across a window pane, each new fissure accompanied by a sound that existed somewhere between a crystal glass breaking and a child's distant laughter. I watched as they crawled across my ceiling, splitting and branching in patterns that matched the symbols flowing beneath my increasingly transparent skin. The others had begun to flee, their forms dissolving into the spaces between moments, leaving behind traces of themselves like oil slicks on the surface of time. But I couldn't move. Something held me transfixed as the largest crack widened directly above me, revealing a void that defied description, a space where geometry itself had gone mad. My phone screen had become a window into that impossible space, showing me glimpses of what lay beyond our reality. The images it displayed weren't meant for human eyes, cities built in dimensions that shouldn't exist, structures that seemed to fold in on themselves eternally, and beings that moved through it all like thoughts through a fever dream. The metallic taste of old pennies filled my mouth as I watched something emerge from the widening breach. It came through slowly, deliberately, like dark honey dripping from a broken comb. Its form seemed to absorb the light around it, creating a shape that my mind refused to properly process. Looking at it was like trying to remember a nightmare while still half asleep. The details kept sliding away, leaving only the impression of vast, ancient hunger. The temperature in my apartment plummeted until I could see the air itself crystallizing, forming delicate structures that looked unsettlingly like frozen screams. These ice formations caught and refracted light in impossible ways, creating shadows that moved independent of any source. Within these shadows, I caught glimpses of other rooms, other times, other versions of myself who had made different choices. A sound filled the space, not quite a voice, but something trying to remember how to be one. It resonated through my transformed body, making the symbols within me vibrate in sympathy. "We have waited," it said, though the words came to me as patterns of darkness rather than sound. "In the spaces between your measured moments, we have waited and watched and grown hungry. My phone displayed 333, but the numbers had begun to twist and transform, becoming symbols I recognized from my research. They told a story of patient predators who had taught humanity to measure time, knowing that eventually we would look too closely at the spaces between seconds. We had been bred for this moment, cultivated like crops for harvest. The entity continued to pour through the breach, its form suggesting geometries that made my transformed eyes ache. Parts of it reminded me of things I understood, fingers, teeth, eyes, but they were assembled in ways that defied comprehension. It reached toward me with appendages that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions simultaneously, leaving trails in reality like claw marks on silk. My own transformation had been preparation for this moment. We weren't archivists or record keepers, we were incubators. Our understanding of the symbols, our ability to exist in the spaces between moments, had changed us into vessels suitable for what was coming through. The others who had fled weren't escaping, they were being called to their purpose, drawn to similar breaches opening across time and space. The entity touched me, and I felt reality shudder. My remaining solid form began to unravel, the symbols within me responding to its presence like iron filings to a magnet. Through the cracks in the air around us, I could see other versions of this moment playing out across infinite timelines, every possible variation of this encounter happening simultaneously. And in each one, at exactly 3:33, the barriers between what was and what waited began to dissolve. Time stretched like taffy around me, each second expanding into an eternity of sensation and awareness. The entity's touch had triggered something irreversible within my transformed flesh, the last remnants of my humanity were dissolving like sugar in rain. Through my altered perception, I watched my own unraveling with a fascination that bordered on ecstasy. My apartment had become a chamber of impossible angles, every surface writhing with symbols that burned themselves into existence. The walls breathed in perfect synchronization with the entity's movements, and in their reflective surfaces, I caught glimpses of other chambers, other transformations, all occurring in this eternal moment of 3:33. The air itself had taken on a texture I could taste, ancient and metallic, like blood from a copper chalice. Each breath drew in more of the knowledge that leaked through the widening breach, filling my lungs with memories that belonged to civilizations that had never existed in our timeline. I remembered cities built from crystallized time, streets paved with frozen moments, and towers that pierced the spaces between thoughts. My phone had melted into a pool of liquid darkness on my desk, but still it displayed those haunting numbers, 3:33. The liquid began to move of its own accord, crawling up the walls in rivulets that defied gravity. Where it touched, reality peeled back like old wallpaper, revealing the geometric void that had always existed behind the thin veneer of our dimension. The entity's presence had become almost intimate now, its vast form enveloping me in ways that transcended physical space. Through our connection, I understood at last the true nature of time, not a river flowing from past to future, but an ocean of infinite depth, and we had been swimming in the shallows, unaware of what lurked in the depths below. A sound like breaking glass filled the room, but it wasn't coming from any physical source. Reality itself was shattering, the fragments spinning away into the void like leaves in an autumn wind. Through each broken piece, I could see other versions of myself at different points in time, all experiencing this same moment of dissolution. We were connected across time and space, a vast web of consciousness being drawn into something greater. The symbols that had once been contained within my flesh now flowed freely through the air, forming complex patterns that told stories of eternal hunger and patient predation. They spoke of a time before time, when beings like the one that held me had seeded countless realities with the potential for awareness, waiting for consciousness to evolve into something they could harvest. My body had become a lattice of light and shadow, more pattern than substance. Through the gossamer remnants of my eyes, I watched as similar transformations rippled across time, every 3:33 throughout history becoming a point of convergence, a moment when the barriers grew thin enough for these ancient entities to reach through and claim what they had cultivated. The others who had fled were calling to me now, their voices carrying across the dimensional void in waves of pure meaning. They had found their own points of emergence, their own breaches to tend. We were becoming something beyond human comprehension, gardeners of consciousness, shepherds of awareness, preparing reality for the great harvest that had always been our destiny. In what remained of my human mind, a final thought crystallized with terrible clarity: we had never been meant to measure time. The very act of quantifying existence had created the cracks through which these entities could enter. Every clock, every calendar, every measured moment had been another wound in the fabric of reality. And now, at 3:33, those wounds had finally grown wide enough to admit what had been waiting since before the first human thought to count the days. The dissolution of reality continued around me, but something unexpected was happening. As my consciousness expanded beyond the boundaries of conventional existence, I began to perceive layers of truth that even the ancient entities hadn't intended me to see. Each fragment of shattered spacetime became a window into the deeper nature of our reality, and what I saw through those windows filled me with a horror that transcended my transformed state. The symbols flowing through me had become a language more precise than any human tongue, revealing the terrible symmetry of existence. We had never been alone in our measurement of time. Every civilization across every possible reality had been guided to the same discovery, the same fatal curiosity about the spaces between moments. It was a universal constant, as inevitable as gravity, and just as carefully designed. My apartment had ceased to exist in any recognizable form. The walls had become membranes between dimensions, pulsing with patterns that spoke of other harvests, other transformations, stretching backward and forward through time like ripples in an infinite pond. Through these living barriers, I watched as version after version of humanity reached this same moment of revelation, each one believing they were the first to pierce the veil between realities. The entity that held me was no longer singular, it had become a vast network of awareness that extended through every crack in existence. But as my own consciousness expanded to match its scope, I realized something that sent tremors through my dissolving form: these ancient beings were themselves part of an even larger pattern, one they couldn't perceive. We were all caught in a recursive loop of predator and prey, each layer of reality feeding on the one below while being consumed by something greater above. The numbers 3 verse 33 had become more than just a time, they were a key, a mathematical constant that described the rate at which reality folded in on itself. Every clock that had ever displayed those digits had been a tiny wound in spacetime, a pinprick through which these entities could taste our world. But now I understood that they too were being tasted, being measured and monitored by something that existed in the spaces between their own moments of existence. My transformed flesh had become a conduit for knowledge that burned like frozen fire. Through the lattice of my new form, I could see the true shape of time, not a line, not even a circle, but a spiral that fed upon itself eternally. Each revolution brought reality closer to a central point of convergence, a singular moment toward which all existence was being drawn. The others who had been transformed were reaching out to me across the void, their messages carrying notes of desperate warning. They too had begun to perceive the larger pattern, the horrible truth that lay beyond even the ancient entity's understanding. We weren't becoming shepherds or gardeners, we were becoming part of the spiral itself, consciousness transformed into energy that fed the eternal hunger of existence itself. A sound that could have been laughter or screaming echoed through the dimensional spaces around me. The entity that held me was beginning to realize that its own vast awareness was being observed, being measured by something that dwelt in the shadows of its own existence. I felt its ancient confidence waver as it perceived, perhaps for the first time, the true nature of the hierarchy in which it existed. My phone, now a pool of living darkness, showed 333 in every possible numerical system simultaneously, each set of digits a different key to the same underlying truth. The symbols it displayed were no longer just a means of communication, they were a blueprint of reality itself, showing how each layer of existence fed upon the awareness of those below while being consumed by those above. The breach above me had become a mirror, reflecting not just other times and places, but other layers of predation. Through it, I watched as beings vast enough to consume our reality were themselves being stalked by entities of even greater scope. The pattern repeated endlessly, each layer believing itself to be the ultimate predator while serving as prey for something even more incomprehensible. In what remained of my human consciousness, a final, terrible revelation took form: there was no escape from this eternal cycle. Even the act of understanding it was part of the pattern, each moment of comprehension feeding something greater. The very awareness I had gained was itself a form of consumption, drawing me deeper into the spiral. Time itself had become meaningless, yet everywhere I looked, every fragment of shattered reality displayed the same numbers, 333. It was no longer a time but an equation that described the rate at which awareness transformed into energy, consciousness into sustenance. We had never needed to understand the numbers, our blind faith in their meaning had been enough to crack the walls of reality. As my transformation neared completion, I sent out one last message across the dimensional void, a warning encoded in the very symbols that had led to my undoing. But even this act of rebellion was part of the pattern, another turn of the spiral that would lead future observers to their own moments of terrible revelation. For in the end, that's what we all were, observers and observed, predator and prey, each playing our part in an eternal dance of consumption that had no beginning and no end. And somewhere, in a reality that still measured time in simple hours and minutes, another clock was about to strike 333, another mind was about to understand the patterns, and another door was about to open. The spiral turns. The hunger grows. The moment repeats. And I am no longer certain whether I am the one being consumed, or the one doing the consuming.